Well, hello and welcome to the Suicidal Tunnel Vision No Way Out webinar. In case we haven't met before, my name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse. I'm also the marketing manager for content here at Axiom, and I'm joined by our subject matter expert. He's also the senior vice president of behavioral health here at Axiom. I'll let him introduce himself in just a moment, but that is our Dr. Les Kertay. And so, as you guys may be aware, this is National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And so in recognizing that, we understand that this is a sensitive subject of what it is that we're talking about today, and these are really difficult discussions to have. However, we also know that the first part in moving forward and be able to help others is to have that dialogue and normalize some of these conversations. So I appreciate all of you for joining. I know it's not easy. I know it's not a fun topic, but we appreciate you joining and participating so that you can not only educate yourself, but also be able to impact somebody else should the event occur. So as I mentioned, we have this one that's going to be going on here, and then we're going to have one more additional webinar event that's specific to this subject. A little bit different type of perspective there. This one is actually going to be over, is it burnout or is it depression? And so we'll pick up definitely some components there of suicide, but we wanted to give you that additional option and so that you can kind of take that back to your workplace and be able to recognize what those signs are as well. So if you'd like to join us for that one, you'll see the link that's right there on the top upper right-hand side of your screen. So you'll just press that register now button. That'll get you signed in, no forms, additional forms to fill out, etc. So in addition to that, you'll see below where we have our resource section that should have a copy of our slide deck and some additional resource tools. So you're welcome to utilize those. And then finally, if you have questions, we want to hear them. We want to hear any kind of comment that you have, any question you may have. There's no such thing as a dumb question. And you also don't have to, we don't have to say your name if you'd feel more comfortable not sharing that. So we can keep that on, we can just see the question as it's typed into the box, and we will cover those throughout the event. But we definitely want to make sure that you can get all the answers that you may need for anything that's related to this subject. With that being said, let's meet Dr. Kertay. Dr. Kertay, thank you for joining us today. Tell us about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me. As you said, I'm Senior Vice President for Behavioral Health here at Axiom. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I have a long history of clinical work, and I've spent the last little over 20 years in mostly corporate settings in disability, workers' compensation, consulting in the industry, really kind of getting more and more interested in developing workplace mental health solutions, because I think we spend a huge amount of time at work, and so providing meaningful mental health support in the workplace is really important. And Axiom gave me an opportunity to come and help build that out. So that's what we're doing. That's me.
I love it. Yes, we are thrilled also that we gave you that opportunity, because you're an amazing part of our team, and we just love everything about you. All right, so how we're going to start out today basically is first of all, we want to kind of give you a poll question to understand. We want to know, have you ever been impacted by a suicide? So whether that would be something that's occurred on a personal level, maybe you've struggled with that yourself in the past, if you've had a friend or a family member, a colleague, neighbor, anything of that sort. Let us know. Put a yes or no in that box, and then we'll go through those results then as we move on throughout the presentation. But in terms of discussion topics, there's several things that we're going to cover. So basically, we're going to start with a story. Actually, Dr. Les is going to start with a story that's personal to him. And so we're going to talk about the different phases of suicide. We're going to talk about the impact that suicide has on every one of us. We're also going to talk about some of the misconceptions. What do we think that we know that may not be correct? Is there a way that we're speaking about things or using terms that aren't appropriate? For that, we're going to talk about some of the altered perception and decision making, and why it is that somebody may not be able to think their way out of a serious situation that may be occurring. And then also have some tips from suicide survivors, those that had attempted suicide but are thankfully still with us. And so they've given some great insight as to what they want us to know. And then we'll wrap that up with the mental health first aid. So Dr. Les, I'm going to go to you first then, and just kind of talk to us about Tell us your story. I love stories. They
Okay.
just mean so much more than just reading something from the paper. So tell us what you want to share.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that, I mean, the place to start here is you see all these faces, and suicide has touched a lot of us, um, and um, and that includes me. So we'll, and I think this is what makes it really hard, because it's a tough subject to talk about, and it's one thing to be academic about it; it's another thing to experience it personally. A little over 11 years ago now, a man who was really my very best friend that I've ever had died by suicide. And I was out with my youngest kids when I got the news, and it was just, like everyone, I was totally startled. And it wasn't something I expected. He was somebody that I had written with, we had worked together, we'd presented professionally together. He was also a psychologist. And, I think that for me, that story connected with a lot of the sort of misconceptions that we have, and how do we think about, why? I think we're always left with that why question, right? We're also always left with regrets. I had breakfast with him 2 weeks before he died by suicide, and I mean, he was about to start a new job. He had just had cataract surgery. It's no overt warning signs of anything. He didn't seem quite right to me, but I didn't ask because I couldn't quite articulate it. And, I'm left with that regret. Would it have made a difference had I asked him how he was doing? I think all of those dynamics play into how suicide impacts people. And it happens to all of us who've been impacted by this. Either we're afraid of those things happening, or we've actually experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Did he have a history that you knew of that maybe had related to any of that?
He did. I had seen him get to this space once before, but it was what was different about it is that he could talk about it. So he and I worked together at a company for 9 years, and pretty much any day that we were both in town, we had breakfast together. At least we grabbed a coffee together, and I'd seen him in this space once before. So I knew that it could happen. And it turns out, actually, that he was, at that point, that previous time, he was really being impacted by a medication. For that matter, I think that's probably something, I wasn't intending right this second to talk about that, but we should file that away. Because I've had the experience of taking a medication that really impacted me emotionally. And, fortunately for me, I sort of recognized, well, wow, that's not me, right? That's just so sudden. But so I knew he could be in that space. And that, unfortunately, feeds into my, geez, should I have said something when we had breakfast?
Yeah. Did I would assume that you had a lot of why questions. You had
I did.
Thinking, why didn't why did he feel like that he could reach out to me, et cetera?
Yeah, well, that's the big question. It's like there were, there were five or six of us who were friends. Any one of us could have been and would have been on his doorstep in 10 minutes. I could have been there in 10 minutes. And the question was, why didn't he call? Right? and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but that's the thing that I finally had to wrestle with myself about, was that if he had been able to call, he
Mm-hmm.
would have.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd be alive, not
Right.
because of anything brilliant I would have said,
Yeah.
but because he would have had enough hope left that he could
Mm-hmm.
make the phone call. He had
Yeah.
lost that. And, we'll talk some more about that, but I think it's a really important insight that, kind of the key component here is that sense of hopelessness, that
Absolutely.
there's just no way out. So we'll come back
Mm-hmm.
to that.
Yeah. Well, kind of looking at the polls then here for what we had, it looks like that we've had quite a few that have been impacted by this, Dr.
Yeah.
Kertay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Is
and
that
that
kind
shouldn't
of,
surprise us.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, talk us through some of the numbers then that kind of go along with this so that we can understand just how common or uncommon that it is and how many people really that are impacted on a bigger
Well,
spectrum.
yeah. I mean, this is the best estimate from 2020. These are numbers from the Centers for Disease Control. 46,000 people died by suicide in 2020. That's one death in every 11 minutes.
Wow.
You know, that's enough. But if you look at the 1.2 million attempted suicides, that's 2 a minute.
Wow.
That's a little over 2 per minute. So this is not I think one of the things that contributes to the mythology and maybe makes it hard to talk about is we think this is rare, and it's not terrible. It's not as rare as it should be. More than attempted actually made a plan. People
Yeah.
will make a plan but don't carry it out. And this estimate is that over 12 million people seriously thought about it. I do think it's worth. I'm not sure where we would put this, but I do think it's worth saying right now that I think one of the things I hear from people is, well, it's everybody thinks about killing themselves at one time or another. That's not true. It's if that thought crosses our mind, it's time to pay attention. What's going on for me that's making that thought show up. 12.2 million is a lot of people who seriously thought about it, but in comparison to a population in the US of 330 million, still relatively rare. And yet, look how many people on this call have been personally impacted by it. And most people will know, and I think it's really important to say and to, we've had a suicide hotline for a long time in the U.S., an 800 number. It is now nationally available as 988, so just 3 digits. That's all people have to remember. You can call that number, you can text that number, you can do chat. That's a really, really important resource. And I don't have figures at this point. This is brand new. I don't have figures at this point for how often it's being used, but a lot of us have been, pushing for this for a long time.
Absolutely. When we talk about some of these things, it's, as I'm sure that you guys all have some experience as well, it's been a traumatic year. We've been through a lot, and I think the things that have gotten my attention the most are kids. And even seeing my son was in high school, and so they had a teen suicide, and it really took a big impact on everybody that knew him. And those are hard conversations. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and here, I'm sure we get into it in different places as well, but I also wanted to ask if you would speak to this idea that whenever we see a celebrity or something of that sort, somebody that's a public figure, that they commit suicide, what is the relationship then? Is there a correlation between an increase in suicide in other areas whenever they see somebody like that?
It's there is a sort of a contagion effect that happens, but it's more
Mm-hmm.
in smaller communities. So we see it in kids. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I mean, there's another statistics that I find just absolutely horrifying in children 10 to 14 and in young people from 14 to 24. It's the second leading cause of death. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in those age groups. That's horrifying.
Yeah.
We do see in high schools, for example, if one student kills themselves, we'll see
Mm-hmm.
a kind of a rash of people in trouble, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily carrying it out, but we'll see people in trouble. And sometimes it happens that carry it out. I'm not really aware of studies that have demonstrated that, when Robin Williams killed
Right.
himself, that's one person that people think about
Mm-hmm.
a lot in this context. I'm not aware of studies that really increased it. What it did do was increase awareness, which in some ways can be a really good thing because then the rest of us are paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. What I do want to ask you about, we have some questions that are already coming in. They're really good, and we're going to get to these that are here. I think we can slot them into some of the other slides that are coming up. But I did want to kind of start with the misconceptions, and ask if you would talk us through that, because I don't know that we all understand that well. What
Yeah,
is and what it isn't.
sure. I mean, it the, I don't even know where to begin sometimes about mythology about this. Um, one of the myths that we have is that once somebody's suicidal, they're always suicidal. I mean, typically, it's a passing moment,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason that we can intervene is that if you can intervene in that moment and get somebody through it, there's a possibility that folks will recover and they won't go back there. It
Mm-hmm.
typically isn't so much about a desire to die. The way that I've said this is suicide's not the problem. Suicide seems like, and I emphasize seems like, a solution to a set of problems that
Mm-hmm.
feel insoluble. I'm in a lot of pain. I can't get any rest, and I feel helpless. I feel out of
Mm-hmm.
control. That's a common description that I hear from people who get to this real place where they're seriously thinking about suicide. And suicide feels like a solution to that problem. Right? I get to rest. I'm doing something active, and the pain will stop.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the problem being, and we can see this, those of us who aren't in that place, we can see the problem is, of course, is that um, you know that's you only get to do that solution once. There's no coming back, and so there are other things to be tried. But I think that is probably the most important thing that I would say.
Mm-hmm.
That along with it typically the the impulse to die by suicide is typically time limited. So our goal is to be able to connect with someone and get them past that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we have to do that multiple times,
Right.
but getting them past the moment is the thing, and that makes it
Mm-hmm.
possible to intervene. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
a couple of One other thing that occurs to me, I think that there's a mythology out there that um, yeah, people who talk about it don't do it. And that is absolutely not the case. Um, Virtually everyone who successfully dies by suicide has talked about it at some point. Maybe not
Mm-hmm.
right before, like my friend Tom didn't at that point, but he's had the conversation previously. So I think that's really important, and it's a time to pay attention when somebody's talking about it. I think a particularly insidious myth that we have to deal with is people are afraid to bring up the word because we're afraid we're going to put an idea into somebody's head. That just does not happen. No one has been asked if they're considering suicide and says, no, I wasn't, but what a great idea. Yeah. That just doesn't happen. Typically, it's a relief. It means that, if I can ask that question in a straightforward fashion, that means that I'm not afraid to hear the answer.
Right.
And that connection is the most important thing. So I'll leave it at that. But
that makes so much sense. Yeah. We've had some questions that were specific to that. The first one was, is it typical for somebody who was previously happy, but now they're severely depressed, bipolar, and hinting at no reason to live, to isolate and push everybody away?
I'm not sure how to answer the question whether it's typical. It certainly does happen. And it certainly, that would certainly make me pay attention.
Absolutely.
Those movements from kind of sudden changes in mood and isolating and particularly pushing people away would, those are all pretty serious warning signs that would make me want to pay attention.
Absolutely. There's also another one on here is there a coupling effect of means or ways versus ability to commit suicide?
Well, so if I go back for a second to this idea that it's typically transient, if I have means available to my, if I have means immediately available, I can carry out that impulse on the spot. If I don't, then if I have to take that extra step, that might just be enough to make pause. We can't really, this isn't about the politics of guns, but it's really important to recognize that 2/3 of gun deaths in this country are suicides. And, those deaths are not homicide, they're suicide. And the problem, of course, is that it's the most lethal means of suicide. So if I have a gun, it's loaded, it's nearby, I have easy access, and I have that impulse, that's a problem, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons that if we have, if I had a patient in therapy who was seriously struggling with thoughts about suicide and they had guns in the house, I would try to arrange for someone else to have them temporarily to make sure that they're locked up. Some way to put a gap between the means and the impulse. So yes, means is something that we get concerned about, particularly if somebody then, if they're feeling suicidal, they've expressed that, and now we see that they're going out and looking for means. Those are all signs that we should pay attention to.
Absolutely.
I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. And then we also had, Ash was asking, will we please bring up the semicolon project? And mentioned many of us who display this are available to talk about it with others. So yes, thank you for sharing that. And the website there is the projects.com. I want to check that out.
It's really worthwhile. I mean, in a sense, it's a wonderful symbol. It's like I was at that point in my life, and it wasn't a period. It wasn't the end. It's a semicolon. It's a change in direction, and it's an indication that people are willing to talk about it.
For sure. Yeah. Well, moving on then, kind of wanted to get into this about the altered perception and some of the decision making. And one of the best, it's hard sometimes to think, whenever you're looking back and you're thinking, why didn't they just call me? Why didn't they reach out? Why didn't they trust me enough with something to say something in advance? And one of the best visuals that I've ever heard of was this spider in the cup type of scenario. And so basically, and this is for all of you. So basically consider yourself, think about if you were a spider and you were inside of a cup. And so you'd been there for weeks and you've been there for months and you knew you wanted to get out, but you haven't been able to. So what have you done? You've walked around the perimeter inside the cup. You don't see any holes. There's no escape route there. So then maybe if the cup was turned upside down, maybe you try to climb up the side of the cup to get out. And you always end up falling back down. It made so much sense that whenever you've been in there for so long, that you don't see that there's other options there. You don't see what your escape route would be. And that's why some of the decisions are made, permanent decisions are made based on what we would consider to be temporary circumstances. Have you ever heard of that, Dr. Kertay?
I've not heard that analogy, but it really is. It's a really graphic illustration of the thing I was talking about, this sense that I have an insoluble set of problems, and the longer it goes, the harder it is to see that there's any other way out of this. In psychology, we call it learned helplessness. I mean, there's a whole literature around this notion of learned helplessness that, we encounter problem after problem and we can't figure out how to solve it. And, and pretty soon everything begins to look like an insoluble problem.
Yeah.
So I hadn't heard that particular analogy, but it makes perfect sense. And I think we can all sort of relate to that experience of, we've been in situations that feel insoluble. Now imagine that going on for, weeks, months, that you keep falling back into it, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a huge part of it. And, for my friend, he got to a place where he just wasn't able to manage it anymore and couldn't bring himself to make the phone call.
The piece about, I know you'll agree here, but that's the piece that I think is so important that we miss sometimes, is that place of where we get to, we're so helpless and we're so hopeless, and you just have been at it over and over and over, and you can't get out yourself. You don't have the means to be able to see what your escape route is, and that's why it's so important that we make for sure that we can reach out, that you can reach out if you're having some of these thoughts and feelings, and get the help of a medical professional.
Right.
To help you.
Well, and it's also important for the rest of us to realize that maybe that person can't reach out, so maybe it's on us to reach out. You've heard me say this. Everybody's heard me say this. People who've been on webinars have probably heard me say this. The four most important words that I can think of to connect with somebody is, how are you doing? Asking that question in a meaningful way and in a way that tells you that I really want to hear the answer can make all the difference. Even if the person doesn't want to talk right then, they've had the experience that somebody reached out, and so maybe there's something there. I happen to notice that, there was a question in there about, how do you respond to someone who seems to be having a problem, but they don't want to talk? Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for one another is just to be there. And just to let people know that we're there and keep letting them know, right? So if I ask somebody how they're doing and I can see, or I think, hey, it looks like you're really having a hard time and they don't want to talk to me, it's not about me, right? I need to not make it about me. I need to,
Mhm.
the next day, ask again.
Yeah.
um, you know, um, and just make myself available. And I think we can do that for one another. Social support is the single best intervention here.
Hmm. Hmm. Real quick, one story that goes along with this. I don't think we had this on the script, but anyways, I'll tell it. It went with the bug in the cup story. But what that physician was explaining was that he had opened the paper and he had saw there was a farmer there that was on the front page of the news, and the farmer had actually died by suicide. And what he explained was that this gentleman had always been so successful throughout his life. He lived on a farm; it was inherited from his family. However, because of economic times, it started to take a downfall, and he wasn't prepared to deal with that. And so the bills were mounting up. He hadn't shared any of that with anybody else. And so he thought that the escape there, instead of putting a burden on his family, he saw that as a burden, but instead of putting that on there, then he ended his life, leaving, his family and his kids and everyone else there without him. And after the fact, they were kind of going back through there, and it was like, wonder why he didn't ask. Why didn't you tell anybody that he was going through this? And I think it comes back a lot to we don't understand. We think that without us being there, or if we had an issue that was there, that by us leaving that, then that would make the problem better. But that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. The other last thing I wanted to, before we leave this right here, I wanted to bring up one more subject with you, Dr. Kertay, and get your thoughts here. But there's also some discussion about the cognitive constriction that you can experience when you're in a suicidal crisis. And I wanted to ask if you would maybe explain that a little bit more, because there's always the question that comes up, well, why in that very last moment, why wouldn't they have been thinking about us? Or, why couldn't they have came up with a different solution? Could you explain that a little bit further, and why that's actually there could be a medical condition that's going on there?
Well, I think we've been talking about it. It's, at a certain point, we lose the perspective. We lose the ability to think. I mean, we've all seen the quote, which gets attributed to a bunch of different people, that, you can't solve a problem with the same kind of thinking that got you there. Well, that's true in this case. The problem is that we don't know. If we had another way of thinking about it, we'd do it. Mm-hmm. And other people may or may not have noticed that we are very deliberately using the phrase, died by suicide, rather than the more common committed suicide, right? And that's a way of acknowledging that, people didn't get up in the morning deciding that they're going to do this terrible thing that's going to end their lives and hurt a bunch of other people around them. They didn't set out to hurt other people. This is part of what was going on for them. And that cognitive constriction, I mean, we all experience it all the time in much smaller ways, right? I can't think of any other way to solve a particular problem. Well, that's one of the reasons that we brainstorm with one another, because two people, can come up with ideas that one person can't. So it's that process, but in an extreme.
Agree. Yeah. There's some additional questions here. I think that we'll get to that. Let's go through what some of the phrases, some of the things that we've heard from those that may have attended, but they're still with us, some of their words of wisdom. And then we'll pick up the rest of these remaining questions that were here. Talk us through these.
Sure. Well, and I've actually heard this from people who have attempted suicide or gotten to the point where they were, really actively thinking about it, and so got help. And what I hear from people is that, it's as if people don't want to ask. They don't want to bring up bad things. But think about how that feels. right? In terms of being isolated, it's important to talk to people. It's part of what happened for them. It's part of their life. If they don't want to talk about it, they'll tell you. What better to ask and be told, I'm not comfortable talking about that right now. I think most of the time people just need the connection. And again, it's not about me. It's about letting somebody know that I'm there. We've already said this, don't be afraid to use the word suicide. And in mental health first aid training, we talked about, like, it's important to be directly ask someone if they're thinking about suicide. When you temper the words, have you been thinking about hurting yourself? Have you been thinking about, maybe you'd rather not be here? When you soften it, really what that communicates is, I'm a little nervous about this conversation.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe I don't really want to hear the answer. It's important to be direct. Are you or have you been thinking about suicide? Being able to say that is important, and it's not going to put ideas in somebody's head. That just doesn't happen. Some of these other things, asking for help and jeopardizing careers, we do see that in the workplace. I mean, people are afraid of that. There's a lot of discussion about stigma in the workplace, and trying to create environments in which people can talk to one another, and creating those environments. And it has to be, we need room to make connections with each other. Just one of the things that happened when we all went virtual during the pandemic, we got more isolated, and we didn't have those opportunities to just talk. If someone does need help, it's important to find a way to do that privately with somebody that you can trust, right? You don't want to announce in the middle of a staff meeting. That's not the place to do it. That's a realistic, kind of boundary that we want to keep, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you can't reach out. We've talked a little bit about the tunnel vision. I've been saying all along, this notion of feeling isolated, and, I may need you to be the one to reach out. I think that's just generally true. And being available to people and telling people that you're available, okay, I hear you that you don't want to talk right now. I just want you to know that it's okay if I'll be around, and check back with people. And this last one I think is also important. And I go back to the idea of the semicolon project, that, I got through this. I didn't die by suicide. I decided not to. I decided to live. That doesn't mean that everything's perfect all of a sudden, and, that I don't still need some assistance or support. I still need that connection.
Absolutely. Completely agree. At this point, let's see, we did have some questions that were here, and we'll run through a few of these.
Sure.
Several, let's see, how do we deal with survival guilt? Ooh, this is a really good one. We keep asking the questions, what could I or should I have done?
Well, I mean, you heard it from me, right? I mean, this is the thing, and the reason that I tell that story. I'm a psychologist. I've been in mental health for over 40 years. I had it with my friend, like, why? Like, what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? I don't have an easy answer to that. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that it's there, and we have to understand that somebody else made a decision to die by suicide. and we didn't have the opportunity to intervene. That's not a very satisfying answer, but just acknowledging that, yes, it's going to happen, and it's just something that we have to work with ourselves. And maybe, maybe if I have that really badly, if I have that really strongly, maybe I need help talking to somebody, because it's really getting to me.
Yeah. The other one was, let's see, I've also heard the phrase complete suicide. Is that appropriate terminology? Is that something that should still be used?
A completed suicide? I think it's less jarring than committed suicide. Sort of the idea behind committing suicide is that there's a sort of implied judgment in it. I think to my ear, I don't think there's a right answer to this. To my ear, completed suicide sounds kind of clinical.
Yeah.
So I probably wouldn't use it. But it's probably better than committed.
Yeah, agreed. Let's see, and then let's see. The other was, what's the best immediate thing to do? We can get into some of this actually whenever we get into the first aid piece. But what should they do if somebody were to say or verbally threaten to die by suicide, then whenever that occurs? Yeah.
They're threatening that they're thinking about it. They're saying that they're thinking about it and actively thinking about it. The image in my mind always is the duck on the pond. You're kind of like that duck is gliding along and looks really calm, and his underneath is paddling like crazy. I mean, I think that the important thing is to acknowledge it, to say, I hear you, what is it that I can do to, can we talk about it? I'd like to talk with you about it. I'd like to offer you whatever kind of support there is. And I think that it's okay at a certain point if someone is talking about it and they're just not able to let go of the idea. I think it's okay to say, listen, I'm going to do whatever I have to do to keep you safe right now. And if that means that I have to pour you into my car and drive you to the emergency room, that's what I'm going to do. Or call someone, call 911, I'm going to, but the first thing that I do is offer support and let that person vent and do my best. And, I'll own it. Like, this is scary. But I'm here with you. And at a certain point, if somebody won't stop, can't bring themselves to let it go, I will say directly what I just said. You've told me, I know what's going on, and I'm going to do anything I have to stop, to keep you safe, right? Not to stop you, but to keep you safe.
Yeah. We had one other question that was here, and I see that it's on the other screen as well, but they were asking about people that may look happy. And I know we've talked about in the past about people that behavior really is really what you're looking for. You're looking at change in behavior. You're looking at small changes from what their norm may be. And that while that is important, behavior can also be deceptive because, in those late times that once they've made a decision to act upon that and they see a way out, you may see that there's a change in their attitude, the way that they look at things. They may all of a sudden, seem like that they're so happy or that, they've worked through this, and you start, thinking, oh, wow, they're getting a lot better. And then something happens after that. Could you cover that? Just kind of briefly speak to why that occurs sometimes.
Well, I think you actually just said it, which is that, it happens that it happens sometimes for people that they've really struggled with this for a long time. They can't see a way out. They're that spider in the cup. And now all of a sudden they saw a way out. And so people will all of a sudden look brighter. In therapy, that's a sign for me. If I had somebody in therapy, I'm going to pay a lot of attention, and I'm going to continue to talk to people about, how they're doing and what's going on. And I'm going to ask the question directly. That's me as a therapist, but I'm going to ask directly. I think someone else that we know, it's like, wow, things have really seemed to have changed for you. What's going on? Yeah. Again, that question, how are you doing, in some meaningful way, I think at least creates the opportunity. And sometimes we don't get a chance.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Let's talk about then how it is that some actions here, and then we'll get into specifically the steps of mental health first aid. But I've seen it come up here on the questions that have been submitted. They were talking about workplace programs and what that looks like, how you get started, and something like that. Talk us through why you need to be looking at resiliency, how that affects your workplace, what you should be looking at long term, what works, what doesn't, etc.
Do we have another hour?
I know.
Yeah. I think we're doing the very first thing, which is, and this is something that the pandemic did for us. Mental health didn't become a crisis overnight because of the pandemic. This has been going on a long time, and it's been increasing for a long time. What I think happened is that we've begun to be able to talk about it. Yeah. And so I think the first thing is we have to have those conversations. I think we need to ask our employees what it is that would help them. What will make a difference. We make a lot of assumptions. I've seen companies make the assumption that, well, we sent everybody home and they seem to be miserable, so we're going to bring them all back to the office. Well, maybe you want to ask. Maybe you want to have that conversation with your workforce. I think it's really important to look at measures. We've built measures into our Tempo Live solution. I think it's important to get a baseline. How is our workforce actually doing, and monitoring that over time. I think one of the things that doesn't really help is just throwing solutions at it without having a plan. Internally, if you have expertise, use that expertise to understand your workers and how to reach them. If you don't, find somebody you can consult with who can help you build those programs. There are meaningful ways to do this, and it's going to vary depending on the workforce, the age of the workforce. One of the things we've seen as people talk more and more about mental health is that the youngest part of the workforce talks about mental health more, but is also less likely to seek traditional therapy. So, do you have a mostly young workforce? Do you have an older workforce? Like, the solutions vary. So I think acknowledging that and taking the time to really understand it is important. I hear, the effectiveness or utilization of EAPs. Most companies now have an employee assistance program of some sort, and utilization typically is really quite low. 2 to 3, maybe 4% is typical. And I think it's really important for a company to find out what its utilization rate is and why. right? Is it because people are not having a good experience? Is it simply because we're getting to people too late? Like we're waiting until they self-refer? You know, that's another piece of this and the reason to do screening. You know, and then, you know, I said it before, the most important, one of the most effective interventions that we know in workplaces is some level of social support, creating opportunities for people to talk to one another and getting them some training so that we're not afraid. And that's where we get to mental health first aid. It's not the only social support intervention, but it's one that I think is really, really valuable. And it's one that we've, you know, I'm a trainer in it, and, you know, we've trained a lot of our people. It's really about helping people be less anxious about asking one another how they're doing. You know, and these are this is the mental health first aid, you know, with capital letters, mentalhealthfirstaid.org. You know, this is their model, and it's not really a linear model that you kind of go through these steps, but it's just a way of remembering that, you know, you can't help someone if you don't approach them, and if you're not kind of assessing as you go along, like, what's the risk here? Probably the most important thing we can do is listening, you know, but you have to approach somebody in order to hear what they have to say, right? So listening non-judgmentally, and that can be hard, you know, because people may have solutions that we don't agree with. Not about me. When somebody else is in pain, I want to try and make it about them. And, you know, how many times have you heard this from like a couple who's having an argument? It's like, yeah, I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to hear me. Right?
So true.
Usually it's a woman saying that to a man, typically, but, you know, it's not the only way that it happens. You know, but I've had that experience too. You know, and sometimes I just need somebody to hear me vent. So a really good question is, what do you need right now? Do you need help solving the problem, or do you need to be heard? That's a perfectly legitimate question. And then, you know, help people get what they, I think giving reassurance and information about what can be helpful is really useful. I think it's an important caveat here is that just telling somebody that it's going to be okay is not particularly reassuring. If you, you know, think about your experience going to the doctor and the doctor just says, oh, it'll be all right. Why? Okay, but what is it? What's going on, right? You have to have had this conversation. And I think it's really important to encourage people to seek professional help if that's appropriate. And it's also important to encourage people to take care of themselves. You know, sometimes just getting up from your desk and going for a walk is the kind of self-care that you need.
Good point.
Right? So, and remembering that, you know, a common question that I've asked people is, well, have you ever been in this place before? What did you do to help yourself at that point? Just reminding people, oh, okay, well, I've been here before. I've resourced this. You know, this works when somebody's distressed. It doesn't have to be when they're thinking about suicide.
Right. Yeah. I love it. There's another question. We still have several more questions. I think we can get them in before the end of time. We've got 5 more minutes, but there's one question that I thought was really good, and we may get into it a little bit more 2 weeks from now, whenever we talk about burnout or depression, because I think there's a significant piece here about family burnout. You know, you can burn out with family members too. It's not just from work, but my 20-year-old son has suffered from anxiety and ADHD since he was in grade school. He's recently been diagnosed as bipolar. There's several members, as are several members of our larger family. He's on medication. He refuses to take it often, making his moods very unstable. He takes a lot of illicit drugs and has been to the emergency room 4 times for either accidental or deliberate overdoses. He threatens suicide often, as sometimes I feel as if it's being used to get back at my wife and I, on an unsettling subject. And how can we deal with this situation?
Wow.
That's tough.
The answer to that is big and long. And I would say the first thing is take some time to get help yourself, to get help with how to deal with this. You know, I don't have an easy, simple answer about that. And the answer is, you know, the answer isn't something simple like, well, you just have to do tough love, or you have to do whatever you have to do. This is going to vary depending on the people involved, depending on the situation. None of what the person asking that question said is unusual. If someone is truly bipolar, it's not unusual for them to abuse substances. It's not unusual for them not to want to take their medicine. You know, it changes the way that you feel. And so I think my first piece of advice is find somebody to talk to about that, to make a plan. How are you going to help your son? And this is very much easier for me to say than it is to do. And I know, having raised 6 kids, at the end of the day, you know, your son's going to make his own decisions, and you can't make them for him forever. But the more important thing is, you know, find somebody to get some resources for yourself.
Yes. Another one we had was, our son's girlfriend threatens suicide whenever he suggests breaking up. To our knowledge, she's never attempted suicide before. How should he handle that?
Yeah. This is one of those questions too that it's almost impossible to answer generically. You know, as I've said, I take every threat seriously. But I also hold people accountable for their behavior. So, you know, I'm going to kill myself if you break up with me. The answer to that might have to be, you know, I don't want you to do that. I want you to get the help that you need, but I'm not going to stay because I'm a hostage. That's really tough, right? But supporting, you know, since this is the parent asking this question, you know, supporting your son in this is the thing that matters, right? Because the son's got to make that decision. You know, figure out how to get through that. I don't take it lightly when somebody threatens suicide, because sometimes they carry it out, and sometimes they carry it out by accident. You know, as a gesture that turns lethal. So I don't take it lightly, but we can't be held hostage by it either. Right? And I apologize for what seems like a simple answer to a very complicated question. I can't, you know, it's the best I can do in a short amount of time.
Seeing some of the questions that came through here, I think I felt like it was important before, but I think it's even more important now that having that discussion about burnout or depression and how that can relate not only to work, but also at home and some of the responsibilities that we have. It tells me that we're on the right road. So I hope that all of you will click that box, that you'll be able to join us in 2 weeks, because we can pick this conversation back up where we left it here, because there's definitely a component there that includes suicide in that piece. Dr. Kertay, thank you so much for all of the insight that you provide. You always do a great job. And I especially thank you guys for being so open and honest with your questions. And because that's how we learn. We all learn from what you ask as well. So thank you again
Yeah, I
for
wish
coming.
we had time to answer all of them.
I know. Thank you all again. We appreciate it. And we'll see you then in 2 weeks.